Pick it up, and don't waste my time. People like you always slow this line down." The words cut through the lobby with a cold edge as Trent Lawson flicked Aisha Hale's visitor credential to the floor like trash. He stepped toward her, grabbed her wrist, and shoved her tote against the steel table with enough force to make the contents jump. The jolt ran up her arm, sharp and humiliating, settling in her chest like a quiet bruise. She steadied herself, not because the pain was overwhelming, but because the moment carried a deeper sting. It exposed the truth she had come here to uncover. And in the space of that single breath, the air shifted. This simple act of cruelty, witnessed by no one who dared to intervene, marked the beginning of the end of Trent Lawson's long career. He did not know it yet. He did not see the collapse already forming around him. But the clock had started. Before we go deeper into this story, where are you watching from today? Take a second to subscribe to the channel and give me a like, so these stories can reach more people who care about justice, dignity, and accountability. On a gray morning, Aisha Hale stepped through the revolving door of the Minneapolis field office wearing a crisp white peacoat, white tailored trousers, and a calm expression that gave nothing away. She moved with quiet purpose, her badge tucked deep in her pocket, her intention clear only to herself. For more than 2 decades, she had served the Bureau with an unbroken record of discipline and excellence. Yet she knew that respect inside these walls was often conditional. Today, she would see, without warning and without title, what happened when a black woman walked in with no visible authority. Trent Lawson stood behind the magnetometer as he had for nearly 2 decades. He greeted a white investment banker with a warm, "Morning, Jim." He nodded at a white attorney with an easy smile and a light joke. Each person passed through without a pause. But Aisha placed her tote on the conveyor. She did not adjust her posture or soften her tone. She simply existed. That alone changed everything. Lawson's gaze traveled over her in a slow, intrusive sweep. Hair, skin, coat, shoes, then back to her eyes with a look that held no respect, only suspicion. ID and purpose of visit. The words held no courtesy, only command. She handed him a standard visitor pass rather than her special agent in charge credentials. He inspected it as if he expected it to fail some private test he had created for people he did not trust. When he let it fall to the floor, the gesture was not careless. It was intentional. It was meant to remind her of a place he believed she belonged. She bent to retrieve it in silence. The moment felt heavy, shaped by years of complaints buried in files that no one ever opened. Inside her coat pocket, her phone recorded everything. Lawson ordered her tote unzipped and every compartment emptied. Pens, a notebook, her wallet, a sealed envelope containing internal evaluation forms she planned to review later. He spread the items across the table in a slow, deliberate pattern, pretending to search for something he already knew he would not find. 17 white and Asian visitors passed during this process. They walked through the metal detector with barely a glance. Not one of them was stopped. Theo Rivera, working the adjacent lane, watched but said nothing. He had seen this before. He knew the pattern. He had chosen silence as the easiest path toward his retirement. When Aisha lifted her eyes toward him, he looked away. His avoidance spoke as loudly as Lawson's hostility. Camila Soto approached from the hallway for her morning coffee. She froze the moment she saw Aisha. Recognition widened her eyes. She began to speak, but Lawson's stare cut her off before the first syllable left her lips. She lowered her gaze and moved on, heart pounding, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. Lawson gestured toward the secondary screening room, a small, windowless box used primarily for suspicious packages, not credentialed visitors. "In there," he said. She walked in without protest. The door closed behind her with a sharp metallic click. She sat in the plastic chair, hands folded, listening to the distant echo of footsteps and the low hum of the ventilation system. Long minutes passed. Lawson returned wearing blue nitrile gloves. He did not offer an explanation. "Jacket off." His tone was cold, firm, and absolute. She replied in a calm voice. "That is not procedure for a credentialed visitor." He leaned forward, placing both gloved hands on the table, letting the silence stretch before answering. "Here, I decide what procedure is." His breath hovered over the words like a challenge. She did not remove the jacket. She did not raise her voice. She did not reveal who she was. She simply held his gaze and waited. In his mind, she was a nameless visitor he could control. In reality, she was the highest-ranking black woman in the entire Upper Midwest Division of the FBI. She was the person responsible for evaluating the very contract his paycheck depended on. And she had seen enough. The moment he stepped out to retrieve yet another set of unnecessary forms, she pulled her phone from her pocket and pressed a single number. The call connected instantly. "Deborah," she said softly. "Minneapolis checkpoint. Initiate compliance protocol now." She did not explain. She did not need to. Assistant Director Deborah Quinn understood. Within minutes, access logs began streaming to Washington. As the data rolled in, the picture came into focus. Black and brown visitors averaged nearly 15 minutes in secondary screening. White visitors averaged just over 1. Over 100 complaints had been closed without investigation. The system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as some people intended, and within hours it would be exposed. As the minutes ticked by in that stark little room, Aisha remained still. She felt no urgency to rush the truth. She allowed the process to unfold in real time, knowing every second brought the collapse closer. Trent Lawson had no idea that the quiet woman sitting under fluorescent lights was holding the final thread of his career in her hand, and she had just begun to pull. Trent Lawson returned to the steel table and pushed Aisha's belongings into a scattered line, as if he were arranging evidence from a crime he had already decided she committed. He motioned with 2 fingers, sharp and dismissive, and told her to empty every pocket of her coat, her jeans, and her tote. His tone carried the quiet cruelty of someone who had done this many times and had never been told to stop. She complied with calm precision, revealing nothing of what she knew or who she was. Her silence unnerved him, though he hid it behind an exaggerated authority. With each slow gesture he made, 17 more white and Asian visitors walked through the lobby unchallenged. They were waved forward, greeted with courtesy, and sent on their way without so much as a pause. It was a ritual he never questioned, a routine that lived in muscle memory, shaped by years without consequences. Theo Rivera saw everything from the next lane. He watched Lawson's posture, the tone of his voice, the way he leaned into Aisha's space. He recognized the pattern in an instant. He had stood beside Lawson for years and had witnessed the same script play out again and again. He felt the pressure in his chest, the old warning that he needed to say something. But retirement was close, and silence had always offered safety. His brief glance toward her was a confession. Even if no words were spoken, he knew this was wrong. He also knew he would do nothing to stop it. When Camila Soto came down the hallway, her steps light and quick on the polished floor, she was thinking about nothing more than a cup of coffee. She turned the corner and froze. She saw Aisha standing at the steel table, her tote emptied, her dignity tested for no reason she could understand. Only days earlier, she had listened to Aisha speak at the all-hands meeting about accountability, fairness, and the duty each person carried to uphold the integrity of the Bureau. That voice now stood silent in front of a man who did not see her worth. Camila took one step forward. "Ma'am," she began, her voice low. but Lawson's eyes locked onto hers with a silent warning. She swallowed the rest of her words, felt a heavy flush rise in her throat, and backed away. She hated herself for it, but she moved on. Lawson tapped the table with the back of his knuckle. "We're not done." He motioned for her to follow him to the secondary screening room. His pace was brisk, and his silence carried a false sense of authority. The room was small, windowless, and cold. A metal table stood in the center. 2 plastic chairs sat on either side. Nothing about the space was built for comfort. He pointed to a chair. "Sit." She did. The door closed behind him with a hard click, leaving her alone with a faint vibration from the ventilation system. She placed her hands on her lap and breathed with quiet control. She had walked into this building prepared for resistance, but she had not expected the level of immediate hostility. Yet she remained steady. She had witnessed far worse in 2 decades of service. She knew how to endure. Long minutes passed. The clock on the wall moved steadily, each second measured by the distant muffled footsteps in the hallway. She heard the faint rhythm of Lawson's boots returning before she saw his face. He entered with a pair of blue nitrile gloves stretched tight over his hands. His expression held a false gravity, as though he had uncovered a reason to treat her like a threat. "Jacket off," he said, not as a question, not even as a request. It was an order built on presumption. She looked directly at him. Her voice was calm, steady, and respectful. "That is not procedure for a credentialed visitor." The room seemed to pause around her words. He stepped closer, both hands braced on the edge of the metal table, his knuckles whitened against the blue gloves. "Here," he said slowly. "I decide what procedure is." His tone held the certainty of someone who had never been corrected, never been challenged, and never been forced to confront the limits of his authority. She did not remove her jacket. She did not engage in the argument he wanted. She allowed the silence between them to stretch until he stepped back, irritated by the quiet confidence he could not decipher. Her phone vibrated once in her coat pocket, a reminder of the tools she carried and the authority she held even in this room. But she did not take it out. Not yet. She watched him leave again, the door shutting with a dull thud. The moment the footsteps faded, she pulled her phone from her pocket with controlled, deliberate movements. There was no anger in her face, only purpose. She pressed a number. 1 ring. Then another. Then a click. "Deborah," she said in a low voice. "Minneapolis checkpoint. Begin compliance protocol." The response was immediate. Understood. No further words were needed. In Washington, the process shifted into motion. The compliance system was designed for moments like this, silent, swift, and unforgiving. Within minutes, the Minneapolis access logs began streaming into a secure review channel. What appeared was not a surprise, but the scale of it was staggering. Months of records painted a precise picture. Black and brown visitors held in secondary screening for an average of nearly 15 minutes. White visitors released in just over 1. Complaint after complaint filed, routed, closed, and forgotten, without a single documented resolution. Patterns of bias woven so deeply into the system that they had become habit, routine, expected. In the dim light of that small room, Aisha absorbed every detail of what she had already known. The numbers confirmed what her instinct had felt the moment she entered the lobby. She slid her phone back into her pocket and folded her hands once more. She was patient, quiet, focused. The truth did not rush. It revealed itself steadily. Outside the room, Lawson moved with the false confidence of someone who believed he controlled the situation. He did not know that every second he wasted, every deviation from protocol, every hostile command was being documented and cross-checked by people far above his position. He did not know that a senior deputy director had already been notified. He did not know that his name was now attached to a pattern the Bureau could no longer ignore. Aisha waited. She did not need the room to be warm or the process to be fair. She needed only time, because time in moments like this was the most powerful witness. And every minute that passed brought her closer to the reveal that would change the course of his life forever. The moment Lawson stepped out to fetch another stack of unnecessary forms, the room fell into a stillness that felt intentional, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Aisha waited 3 long seconds, then reached into the inner pocket of her peacoat and drew out her phone with a slow and steady motion. She did not hesitate. She pressed a single contact, one reserved for situations where the system needed to see itself without filters or excuses. When Assistant Director Deborah Quinn answered, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who understood urgency without needing it explained. "Deborah," Aisha said softly, her tone controlled. "Minneapolis checkpoint. Initiate compliance protocol now." There was a brief pause, not from confusion, but from recognition. "Understood," Deborah replied. "No questions. No requests for clarification." The call ended in less than 5 seconds, but its impact began unfolding instantly. Headquarters engaged the automated review pipeline, and the Minneapolis field office's access logs, screening times, personnel actions, and visitor records began streaming into Washington in real time. Within minutes, a small team of analysts observed the pattern forming on their screens. A pattern so consistent, so mathematically blatant that denial was no longer possible. Over the past months, Black and brown visitors had been rerouted into secondary screening at a rate 5 times higher than white visitors. Their average detention time was nearly 15 minutes. For white visitors, it was just over 1. More than 117 complaints had been filed through various reporting channels. All were closed without investigation. The system did not fail quietly. It failed loudly, repeatedly, and predictably. And every data point that surfaced now strengthened the case Aisha had known she would find. Inside the small screening room, she placed her phone back into her pocket and returned her hands to her lap with deliberate calm. She understood what would happen next. Protocol required headquarters to cross-check the visitor logs against camera timestamps, personnel sign-ins, and prior disciplinary reviews for each officer posted at the checkpoint. Those layers of data would reveal not only what occurred today, but what had been occurring long before she arrived. Aisha remained still, letting the truth move through the channels she had activated. She had been passed over for promotion for years despite her record, her leadership, and her unwavering service. She had learned long ago that change in institutions rarely came from public confrontation. It came from documented truth, exposed at the right moment, by the right person, with undeniable clarity. And now the clarity had begun. Headquarters analysts flagged the earliest signs of what appeared to be targeted screening decisions from Trent Lawson. He had worked the same post for years. He rotated shifts with predictable precision. His logs reflected nearly every documented complaint. Yet his personnel file showed no disciplinary actions, no retraining, and no supervision beyond routine performance reviews. The gap between documented misconduct and administrative response was striking enough that the system triggered an automatic escalation alert to the Deputy Director's office. Assistant Director Deborah Quinn walked the findings down the hallway to Deputy Director Kai Brooks, a man who had known Aisha since her early years in the Bureau. When Deborah placed the report in front of him, he read it in silence, his expression tightening at each line. "Who is the visitor he has in secondary screening right now?" he asked. "Special Agent in Charge Hale," Deborah said. Kai closed the folder. The decision was made in that second. While this was unfolding, Lawson paced the hallway outside the screening room with growing irritation. He believed he was establishing control. He believed he was teaching a lesson. He did not know that every minute he delayed, every deviation he imposed, and every unnecessary demand he made was being recorded and reviewed by people with authority far beyond his own. When he re-entered the room wearing a posture of false authority, he dropped a set of forms on the metal table. "You'll fill these out," he said. His tone assumed compliance. His confidence assumed ignorance. Aisha offered no resistance, no argument, no hint of the shift already underway outside the narrow walls of that room. She simply took the forms into her hands, not to complete them, but to maintain the silence that allowed the system to continue revealing itself. Headquarters continued the audit with accelerated speed. Analysts cross-referenced visitor demographics with specific officers on duty. The numbers illuminated a clear imbalance. On days when Lawson worked, secondary detentions of minority visitors spiked sharply. On days he was absent, the disparity nearly disappeared. The correlation line was so exact that one of the analysts paused, recalculated, then ran it again to ensure it was not an error. It was not. Meanwhile, the internal complaint logs revealed something even more troubling. Several complaints filed against Lawson included language noting patterned behavior, forced secondary screening, and aggressive tone. Each one ended with the same closing note: resolved without need for action, no interviews, no witness reviews, no body camera footage requested. The system had been designed to catch this, yet the people managing the system had looked away. Back in the small room, Aisha lifted her eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the building. She thought about the officers who had once trained her, the supervisors who had guided her, and the years she had spent believing that change came slowly but steadily when good people kept pushing. She also thought about the young agents she led now, agents who trusted her, agents who carried the weight of representation every time they walked into a room where few looked like them. She carried those agents with her today. She carried her younger self as well, the woman who had walked into the bureau with hope, determination, and faith in the system she served. That faith had been shaken many times, but never broken. Today, she would not let it break. At headquarters, Deputy Director Brooks closed the final report with a quiet but decisive motion. He stood, gathered a team of senior personnel, and instructed them to prepare an unscheduled visit to Minneapolis. His voice carried no anger, only purpose. "This stops today." The team moved quickly, coordinating flights, notifying the regional Allied Universal leadership, and preparing the documentation needed to confront the issue directly. The plane would land soon. The moment they stepped into the Minneapolis field office, the truth that had remained hidden behind habits, assumptions, and unchecked authority would finally emerge into the open. Aisha felt the shift before she heard the footsteps approaching from the hallway. The process had begun, and once it began, it could not be stopped. Every action taken from this moment forward would expose the truth not only of one officer's behavior, but of a system shaped by years of silence and neglect. Trent Lawson had believed he controlled this room. He believed he controlled her, but the system he relied on to shield him had already started to crumble. And the person sitting quietly in front of him, calm, steady, and patient, was the one who had pulled the first stone from its foundation. The lobby was unusually quiet for mid-morning. The kind of quiet that settles over a place moments before everything changes. Trent Lawson stood near the secondary screening door, still lecturing Aisha in a tone he believed conveyed authority. He spoke with clipped words and narrowed eyes, convinced he was managing a difficult visitor. He had no sense of the shift already underway. He had no idea that the man who now entered the Minneapolis field office was the second highest-ranking official in the entire FBI. Deputy Director Kai Brooks stepped through the glass doors with 4 federal agents at his back, and the regional director of Allied Universal beside him. Their stride was firm. Their silence was deliberate. Their purpose could be felt across the marble floor. Theo Rivera saw them first. His face drained of color as he realized exactly who had arrived and why. Camila Soto, emerging from the hallway with a file pressed to her chest, nearly froze mid-step when she recognized the deputy director. And in the center of it all, Lawson kept talking, unaware that the world around him had already shifted beyond his control. His voice floated through the open doorway of the secondary screening room, a voice filled with scorn, certainty, and habitual condescension. Kai Brooks stopped just inside the lobby and spoke with calm authority that carried across the entire space. "Special Agent in Charge Hale, where is she?" His tone left no room for confusion. Every head turned, every conversation stilled. Lawson blinked, confused by the sudden silence. He stepped halfway into the doorway, shoulders squared, trying to maintain the posture he had built over years of unchallenged control. "There's a woman being processed for," he began, but the words dissolved when Brooks stepped aside. Aisha Hale walked forward, jacket folded over her arm, posture straight, expression steady. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her presence alone rearranged the balance in the room. Lawson's face drained as realization dawned. His mouth opened, then closed again, as if his mind could not collect the words fast enough. He had spent the morning humiliating the highest-ranking black woman in the Upper Midwest Division, the special agent in charge who oversaw major operations from Minneapolis to Fargo, the very person who approved, renewed, and evaluated the contract that kept him employed. The room seemed to inhale as Aisha stepped out of the doorway. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at him with anger. Her calm was more devastating than outrage. It told every witness that what happened here would be remembered in perfect detail. Deputy Director Brooks approached her with quiet respect. "Special Agent in Charge Hale," he said, lowering his voice. "My deepest apologies for the reception you received this morning." Those words, spoken publicly, formally, and without hesitation, cut through the lobby with a clarity that left no ambiguity about who had been wronged. The Allied Universal Regional Director stepped forward, his posture tense, his eyes fixed on the floor. He knew what this meant. He understood the magnitude of what had been uncovered in the last 90 minutes, and he knew that the man standing just a few feet away, stunned, pale, and breathless, had become the center of a scandal that would not be contained. Lawson tried to form an explanation. He muttered something about procedure, required verification, visitor discrepancies. But the words fell apart the moment they left his lips. There was no policy, no protocol, no internal rule that could justify the behavior he had displayed. The silence that followed felt heavy and final. It carried the weight of every complaint that had been ignored, every pattern that had been overlooked, every decision that had gone unchallenged simply because those in power chose not to see. Theo Rivera stepped backward, pressing himself against the wall as if distance might shield him from the fallout. He felt the truth rising fast, a wave formed by years of complicity. He had watched. He had stayed silent. And now the room was filled with people who could see exactly what silence had protected. Kai Brooks turned to the Allied Universal Director. "We will address this immediately. Your office will receive a formal notice of inquiry within the hour." The director nodded, his voice too tight to respond. Aisha stood still, composed, watching the room observe her with new understanding. None of the visitors who had passed her earlier could reconcile the image they had formed of her. Quiet, patient, disregarded, with the authority now surrounding her. She saw the shift in their expressions, recognition, respect, and for some, shame. Camila Soto stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "Deputy Director," she said quietly. "I saw what happened." Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. "It was wrong." Kai nodded once, a sign of acknowledgement and gratitude. She stepped back with relief mixing with fear. But she had spoken, and it mattered. Lawson's hands hung uselessly at his sides. His voice, once sharp and commanding, was little more than a whisper. "I didn't know," he murmured. "I didn't know who she was." Aisha turned her head slightly. Her voice carried the quiet strength of a woman who had endured far more than this single incident. "You were not required to know who I was," she said. "You were required to treat me with dignity." The words landed with the force of truth. They struck not through volume, but through clarity. They pierced every layer of excuse he had built. His face flushed. His breathing grew shallow. He understood in one crushing moment that his career was not simply shaken. It was ending. Not because she sought revenge, not because she revealed his actions, but because the system that had sheltered him had finally been forced to look directly at him. Kai Brooks stepped forward again, now with finality. "Officer Lawson, please accompany the regional director to the conference room." His tone was calm, firm, and unmistakably decisive. Lawson took one slow step, then another, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. The regional director placed a hand on his arm, guiding him toward the hallway. As he walked, he could feel dozens of eyes on him, eyes that had once glanced past him without notice, now fixed with disbelief or quiet judgment. He passed Theo, who looked away. He passed Camila, who did not. He passed Aisha last. She did not move. She did not speak. Her silence held the truth he had tried to hide for years, and with every step he took, he felt the weight of the consequences forming behind him, steady and certain, waiting for him on the other side of the door. He knew with painful clarity that the moment he had flicked a woman's ID to the floor that morning was the moment he had destroyed his own career. And nothing in this building, not policy, not history, not habit, could put it back together again. 72 hours after the confrontation in the Minneapolis field office lobby, the fallout began with a force neither Allied Universal nor Trent Lawson had ever imagined. The FBI's Civil Rights Division, joined by attorneys from the Department of Justice, opened a formal investigation into the company's federal security practices nationwide. What started as one officer's misconduct immediately widened into something far more severe. Records from multiple field offices surfaced, showing more than 1,400 black applicants and employees adversely affected over several years. Patterns of discriminatory screening assignments, retaliatory scheduling, and buried internal complaints emerged with quiet, devastating clarity. For years, managers had written phrases like "the Lawson issue" or "needs attitude coaching" in private emails, but took no action to address the problem. Some of those emails now came straight into the hands of federal investigators, and for the first time in the company's long history with federal contracts, the shield of internal discretion fell away. A detailed review of screening logs revealed that Aisha's experience was not unusual, but part of a prolonged, documented pattern. Individuals who did not fit Lawson's idea of belonging faced disproportionate scrutiny without cause. The evidence was not ambiguous. It was overwhelming. By the afternoon of the third day, Lawson was suspended without pay, pending the outcome of the investigation. The message was delivered by the regional director in a brief meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes. Lawson sat across the conference table, shoulders tight, hands clasped in front of him. The director did not offer sympathy. He simply read from a prepared memo, his tone formal and distant. Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid administrative suspension. You are not to enter any Allied Universal facility or communicate with active personnel until notified. Lawson nodded. though his eyes remained unfocused. He had imagined consequences in the past, small ones, temporary ones, but never this. When the meeting ended, he left the building with the weight of an ending he could not yet articulate. Within an hour, Lawson made a phone call he believed would save him. He contacted his uncle Elias Crow, the Allied Universal Regional Vice President for the Midwest Division. The two had long maintained a careful, unspoken understanding. Lawson handled day-to-day operations, and Elias ensured that problems quietly disappeared. But this time, Elias's voice held no reassurance. "I'm not intervening," he said. "You're on your own." The words were delivered without hesitation, without explanation. Lawson felt the ground fall beneath him. He had always believed that family loyalty would shield him. Instead, his uncle's refusal confirmed how serious the situation had become. Elias understood something Lawson had not yet accepted. This was bigger than a single complaint. It was a federal investigation into systemic misconduct that stretched across states and years. Saving Lawson now would risk the entire division. The pressure grew heavier when internal emails and archived messages began circulating among investigators. One file, handed over quietly by a supervisor hoping to avoid personal liability, contained clipped exchanges from years earlier. "Lawson needs cooling off. Visitors complaining again." Another read, "If Lawson screens them, it always takes forever. Keep him away from front lanes when VIPs are expected." These messages, though informal, painted a pattern too consistent to ignore. But the most damaging evidence arrived from someone Lawson had never considered a risk. Theo Rivera. With retirement just months away, Theo faced a harsh reality. If he stayed silent, he might lose his pension as part of the broader misconduct review. If he cooperated, he risked the reputation of a lifetime spent avoiding conflict. The decision weighed heavily on him, but the fear of losing everything he had worked for finally broke his long silence. Late one evening, he placed a small thumb drive on the conference table during an interview with the investigating team. His hands shook as he pushed it across the surface. "These are internal emails," he said, "from the last several years. Notes, complaints, things we didn't handle right." There was shame in his voice, but there was also resignation. He knew he had waited too long. Yet he knew that doing nothing now would be worse. The thumb drive contained years of ignored incident reports, handwritten supervisor notes, and call logs that referenced frequent issues with Lane 2, the lane Lawson had manned for most of his tenure. It included a troubling exchange in which a manager dismissed a visitor's complaint because "Lawson is rough, but he gets the job done." Another email noted, "If we discipline him, we risk losing the contract. Visitors complain, but Department of Homeland Security doesn't." That single sentence became one of the most cited pieces of evidence in the early inquiry, proof that the company knowingly prioritized contract stability over fair treatment. The investigators documented everything. They interviewed supervisors, reviewed training files, and traced lines of responsibility through the company's hierarchy. Each layer revealed deeper negligence. Amid this unfolding crisis, a young intelligence analyst stepped forward, someone whose voice carried more weight than she realized. Camila Soto submitted a formal statement outlining the events she witnessed the morning Aisha was detained. Her account was direct, factual, and unembellished. "I observed Officer Lawson raise his voice without cause," she wrote. "I attempted to acknowledge Special Agent in Charge Hale, but was prevented by Officer Lawson's hostile stare. The treatment did not align with any recognized protocol." Although brief, her statement added a critical piece to the narrative: corroboration from within the FBI itself. It confirmed that the discrimination was not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate act of misconduct. As the inquiry expanded, Allied Universal executives attempted to contain the damage. They issued internal memos about enhanced training, scheduled emergency compliance meetings, and tried to reassure staff that the company would weather the investigation. But the numbers were too severe. The government oversight committees watching from Washington saw the issue not as isolated misconduct, but as a systemic failure of oversight, policy, and culture. Media inquiries began to circulate. Community leaders in Minneapolis demanded transparency. Civil rights organizations requested access to the findings. For the first time in years, the company's protective walls, built from contracts, influence, and long-standing relationships, began to crack. In the center of this storm, Lawson isolated himself. He avoided calls. He ignored messages. He sat for hours in his apartment, replaying the moment the deputy director spoke his name in the lobby. He remembered the silence that followed. He remembered Aisha's calm expression, one that did not show anger, but something far more powerful: clarity. A clarity he had never recognized in the people he dismissed so easily. His world was collapsing not through sudden rage, but through a slow, steady unraveling. Every ignored complaint, every unnecessary command, every moment of silent cruelty had returned to him in a single wave. And as the week drew to a close, it became painfully clear that the investigation had already moved beyond him. He was no longer the center of the story. He was merely its catalyst. The system he relied on to shield him was gone. The truth had surfaced, and the consequences, slow, grinding, and unavoidable, had only just begun. The administrative hearing began in early spring and stretched through the long months that followed, unfolding not in sudden bursts of drama, but in steady, deliberate steps that wore down every excuse Allied Universal had carried for years. The conference room on the 12th floor of the Federal Building in downtown Minneapolis became the center of a slow reckoning. Witness after witness took their seat. Attorneys presented charts, logs, emails, and timelines. The atmosphere was formal, restrained, and unyielding. It was not a criminal trial. It did not need to be. The structure of the hearing, methodical, administrative, and deeply procedural, had a weight of its own. Every question, every document, every confirmed pattern tightened the frame around Trent Lawson's conduct and the corporation that had sheltered him. The review panel listened with steady composure as investigators presented nearly 2 decades of data. The numbers spoke with clarity no cross-examination could dilute. On days when Lawson worked the front lanes, secondary detentions rose by more than 200% for Black and brown visitors. On days he was absent, the disparity nearly vanished. Complaint logs revealed a repeating cycle. Visitors filed grievances, supervisors noted concerns, and the issues disappeared into closed case folders without action. The company's own internal messages, retrieved from the thumb drive Theo Rivera surrendered, showed managers joking about Lawson's temper, warning each other to rotate him off when VIPs arrive, and acknowledging the Lawson pattern in language that shifted from casual to resigned over the years. What emerged was a portrait not only of bias, but of institutional neglect, a system that tolerated behaviors because confronting them would have been inconvenient. Lawson sat at the defense table through each session. At first, he tried to maintain the posture of a man wrongly accused. He sat straight, kept his hands folded, and attempted controlled breaths. But as the hearing progressed, the evidence eroded whatever confidence he had carried. The panel did not raise their voices. They did not shame. They simply followed the facts wherever they led. With each confirmation, each corroborated pattern, Lawson's shoulders sagged a little more. His attorney pressed arguments about inconsistent policies, unclear training, and the challenges of high-pressure security roles. But none of those explanations survived the weight of what had been documented. The hearing was not driven by emotion. It was driven by precision. When Aisha took the stand, she did not offer dramatic testimony. She spoke with calm clarity, describing the events of that morning without embellishment. She detailed the absence of protocol, the unnecessary escalations, and the consistent differential treatment of other visitors she observed. Her tone was steady. Her presence was composed. She did not look at Lawson while she testified. She did not need to. Her words alone held the truth. When she stepped down, even those who had been resistant to the investigation understood that the system had failed in ways too deep to ignore. Theo Rivera testified next. His hands shook as he adjusted the microphone. He admitted with halting honesty that he had seen patterns for years. He acknowledged that he had stayed silent for fear of losing his pension. The room was quiet as he spoke, not with judgment, but with the weight of what silence costs. The panel thanked him for his cooperation. Theo nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the table. The shame of years pressed down on him. His testimony helped the panel understand the atmosphere that had allowed misconduct to continue without interruption. It also made clear that his silence had consequences far beyond his fear. Months passed. The hearing continued. Allied Universal executives testified about training practices, screening protocols, and managerial responsibilities. Many tried to distance themselves from the decisions that had allowed Lawson's conduct to continue unchecked. But the paper trail was too detailed, too complete, and too damaging. The federal attorneys pressed forward, presenting not anger, but consistency. They described the accumulated harm in numbers, policies, and patterns. And when they finished, the panel deliberated with the same measured pace they had maintained throughout. The decision was announced in late winter, nearly a year after the process began. It was delivered in a formal session attended by company representatives, legal counsel, and community observers. The lead panelist read from the findings with calm precision. Trent Lawson was terminated for cause. He forfeited his entire pension. He was permanently debarred from working on any federal contract in any capacity for the remainder of his life. The ruling was final and irreversible. 28 plaintiffs filed coordinated civil actions based on the findings, using the hearing's documented patterns as the backbone of their cases. The lawsuits did not come from anger, but from necessity, each seeking to address a part of the long-standing harm the investigation had exposed. For Allied Universal, the consequences were severe but not terminal. The company settled with affected employees and applicants, paying more than $4 million in back pay and offering reinstatement to individuals whose careers had been derailed by discriminatory practices. The settlement was structured without admission of guilt, but the requirements for reform were explicit and binding. Mandatory reporting procedures were established. Supervisory review boards were created. Training protocols were rewritten from the foundation up. Every federal building under their contract would operate under a new compliance structure, one Aisha had helped design. Lawson's life changed quietly, but completely. He moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in South St. Paul, far from the neighborhoods he once patrolled with routine confidence. The furniture was sparse. The walls were bare. His days were filled with long hours and quiet stretches of reflection he did not know how to manage. His wife filed for separation shortly after the hearing concluded. She explained her decision with steady sorrow, telling him she needed distance from the life he had built and the choices that had led to this moment. Old friends stopped responding to messages. Calls went unanswered. People who once greeted him warmly at staff gatherings now avoided contact, unwilling to be associated with the case that had traveled through federal channels and into community discussions. He applied for private security positions, one after another. Each application ended the same way. Once his name was entered into a search engine, the interviews vanished. In some cases, he was informed politely. In others, he simply never heard back. He became a man known not for years of service, but for the investigation that had defined its end. He tried to explain it to himself, to rationalize the outcome, but the explanations always fell short. The truth had become part of the public record. It could not be rewritten. As winter deepened, he walked the quiet streets near his apartment, thinking of the moment, simple, careless, and arrogant, when he let a visitor credential fall to the floor. He replayed the look on Aisha's face in the lobby when the deputy director called her title. He replayed her words in the hearing. "You were not required to know who I was. You were required to treat me with dignity." That sentence remained with him, echoing in the long silence of his days. It marked the dividing line between the life he had before and the life he now lived. And as the months passed, the consequences that began in a quiet lobby continued shaping the world around him, steady, patient, and irreversible. 18 months later, the Minneapolis field office no longer resembled the place where Aisha Hale had stood in silence while Trent Lawson dismantled her dignity one command at a time. Reform had not arrived with fanfare. It arrived through patient reconstruction, each change built with intention, precision, and the unwavering recognition that what happened that morning could not be allowed to happen again. The checkpoint that once felt tense and uneven now moved with the quiet efficiency of a system designed for fairness. Clear conveyor lanes guided visitors with simple steps. New 360-degree cameras recorded every interaction, ensuring that accountability no longer depended on memory or courage alone. Digital wait time boards displayed estimated screening durations in 3 languages, reflecting the communities most often served by the building. Every visitor, regardless of their appearance, their accent, or the assumptions others might carry, walked through identical procedures. No exceptions, no shortcuts, no unspoken rules. A young black agent stepped through the magnetometer one morning without a second glance from the officers on duty. Her badge remained clipped to her belt. Her posture was relaxed. The guard nodded with the same neutral respect he offered every visitor. She passed through in less than 30 seconds, just like those before her and those after. The transformation was not dramatic. It was consistent, and it carried the quiet weight of justice restored. Above the checkpoint, on the glass balcony overlooking the lobby, Aisha Hale stood with her hands resting lightly on the railing. She had visited this place many times over the past months, not to inspect, not to supervise, but to observe in silence. She watched the flow of visitors, the measured pace of the officers, and the small details that reflected the new culture taking root. She did not smile triumphantly. She did not look for recognition. She simply nodded when the new officer on post, a Somali-American woman who had completed the enhanced bias training program, glanced up with respectful acknowledgement. Their exchange was quiet and meaningful. One carried the memory of what this building once represented. The other carried the promise of what it had become. This was the change Aisha had hoped for, not loud, not temporary, but enduring. Her review of the space complete, she stepped away from the railing and walked down the hallway with measured calm. She had long understood that justice was rarely shaped by single dramatic moments. It was shaped by steady work, careful documentation, and the resolve to hold systems accountable even when the process felt slow. She thought about the early morning she walked in unannounced, the sting of humiliation on the steel table, and the quiet strength required to remain silent until the truth revealed itself. She carried that memory without bitterness. It served as a reminder of her responsibility, to herself, to her agents, and to the communities watching how the Bureau handled the people it served. On the far edge of St. Paul, in a cold warehouse rented by a small private firm, Trent Lawson moved through the dim aisles with a flashlight in hand. The warehouse was quiet except for the soft echo of his steps across the concrete floor. He checked padlocks, scanned inventory lists, and adjusted tarps covering crates stacked against the walls. His posture had changed in the months since the hearing. His shoulders slumped. His movements were slower, more deliberate. The crisp confidence he once carried had disappeared. The flashlight cast a narrow beam across the empty shelves, revealing dust in the air and long, silent rows of unused space. He paused near a stack of boxes and leaned against a wooden crate, listening to the small crackle of the radio clipped to his belt. The radio was cheap, the kind issued by temporary employers who hired men like him with limited questions and limited expectations. A faint voice broke through the static. Local news update. FBI reports first increase in black agent hiring in 20 years. The words drifted through the warehouse with quiet clarity. Lawson froze. He listened as the report continued, describing national recruitment programs, expanded training pipelines, and new oversight guidelines introduced as part of the federal reforms triggered by the Minneapolis investigation. He closed his eyes as the truth settled into him. The system he once manipulated without consequence had not only held him accountable, it had grown beyond him. The reforms implemented to prevent his behavior had created opportunities for others he once dismissed with silent contempt. He reached for the radio and clicked it off. The warehouse fell back into silence. He continued walking, the light from his flashlight cutting through the shadows. His footsteps echoed in long, empty corridors. He felt the weight of the consequences he once believed he could outrun. The job paid little. It offered no benefits, no pension, and no path forward. It was a position given to men who had nowhere else to go. At night, he sometimes replayed the moment in the lobby when the deputy director spoke Aisha's title aloud. He remembered the silence that followed. He remembered her steady gaze, calm and controlled. That moment stayed with him, not because it shamed him, but because it revealed the truth he had refused to see. He had built a career on assumptions rooted in power and bias. He had believed those assumptions were harmless and invisible. But they were neither. And the world had changed around him. Meanwhile, the new compliance standards implemented after the investigation spread to federal buildings across the country. Aisha helped refine training modules, review procedural guidelines, and advise senior officials on the long-term oversight plan. She did not seek recognition. She preferred to work behind the scenes, allowing the reforms to speak for themselves. She attended community meetings in Cedar Riverside, listening to residents express relief that their concerns were finally reflected in policy, rather than buried in bureaucratic silence. She met with young applicants from underrepresented backgrounds, offering guidance and encouragement as they pursued careers in federal service. Her presence alone gave weight to their aspirations. Her leadership offered proof that systemic change, while slow, was possible. Back at the warehouse, Lawson finished his rounds and returned to the small break area near the loading dock. He sat on a metal folding chair and looked at the floor, his thoughts heavy and unsteady. He wondered how long he would stay in this job. He wondered how different his life might have been if he had chosen decency when no one was watching. He wondered whether he would ever find a place that did not judge him for what he had done. He lifted his head and stared into the shadowed expanse of the warehouse. Then he stood, picked up his flashlight and continued walking deeper into the dim aisles. Across the city, as the field office she now shaped with steady hands, Aisha paused near the doorway leading to the stairs. She looked once more at the checkpoint below. She saw fairness where there had been hostility. She saw structure where there had been inconsistency. She saw dignity where there had been disregard. She turned and walked away with quiet resolve. The system had changed. The culture had shifted. The future looked different because the truth had been brought into the light. And somewhere in the cold, quiet dark of a warehouse on the edge of St. Paul, the man who once believed he controlled the line walked alone, carrying the weight of a lesson he learned too late. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe and give it a like.